Where do you start with determining that a whiskey is good? Judging a whiskey, determining whether you like it, whether you think it's good or not. That sounds like such an obvious question. It sounds like you would just take a sip of it and it's either good or it's not good. And I will say, and I want to start by saying this actually, 99% of the time, that's the case. 99% of the time, it is good enough to taste a whiskey, decide if you like it or not, and move on. And it's like, I like this one, I don't like that one. I like that one, I don't like that one. That's totally fine. I think also when I'm judging whiskeys, when I'm going through barrel picks, things like that, I usually give a lot of weight to my gut reaction. To my gut reaction to the whiskey. I give a lot of weight to, as soon as I take a sip of it, what do I just think? Like, what comes to mind? Do I enjoy it or not? Same thing for notes. What comes to mind immediately? Those are usually the best notes to go with. So, there's a ton of weight there, but there is some utility in getting more specific with why a whiskey is good and what you like about it. It's important because you may want to dig deeper, especially when you're considering what you're going to buy next. You want to know what it is that you like about it. You don't just want to know, I like this one. You might want to know, why do I like this one? What is it about it that I enjoy so that when I buy my next one, it can have that or it cannot have that, and I can know what that feature is, what that characteristic is of the whiskey. Which aspects of the whiskey are most important to you? You'll never know if you just always go, I like this one, I don't like this one. You might want to dig into, like, what's actually important. You know, some people want a really good nose. Like, that is the most important thing to them because they spend most of their time nosing it and then they just take a sip on occasion. Some people just care what it tastes like on the palate. That's all they really care about. And there's a lot of people, I actually just met a couple literally yesterday, who care a lot about the finish. That's like the most important to them because they're like, the finish is what I'm going to be tasting. Like, let's say I'm sitting down, I'm having a glass of whiskey, I'm having a conversation with somebody. I take a sip of the whiskey, I taste the palate, sure, and then I swallow the whiskey, and then I'm sitting there having a conversation. The thing I'm going to taste the majority of the time is going to be the finish because I'm taking these big breaks in between sips. So some people, the finish is the most important. Okay, well, out of all those things, regardless of which phase is the most important to you, which characteristic of that phase is the most important to you? And we're going to break down what that looks like what elements, what characteristics should you be looking at? You know, we've heard a lot about complexity, smoothness, things like that. I actually don't look at smoothness specifically. Smooth is just a common word that a lot of people use, but it gets kind of covered in my rating system, which we'll look at. So we're going to break down my rating system that I use when I am reviewing whiskeys. And also, this is a newer rating system. Sorry, a little something in my throat today. This is a newer rating system. And we're going to talk about some improvements that I might make to it here soon because sitting down, writing out this episode, and also talking with some other folks, I thought I might have a little bit of a blind spot in the way I rate my whiskeys. So we will probably be updating that rating system. All of that in today's episode as we look through what makes a whiskey good. How do you judge whiskey? And all of this boils down, the reason I find this the most important is because it boils down to, what do I look for in future purchases? And I think that's the most important. You want to make sure you're not wasting your money, right? Well, if you understand what it is that you're looking for and how a reviewer might address that, what a reviewer might say about that, then you can watch some reviews of a bottle that you're considering buying, and you'll know from those reviews, okay, this is the one that I want. Okay, I want to buy this because they are saying these kind of key words that make me realize this is the one that I want. Or, if you're a member of the Whiskey Noobs crew, you can look through my reviews, which I'm about to post. They'll probably be posted. They might be posted by the time this episode comes out. My reviews, which I'm going to be posting, that have my rating system in them, and you can know, okay, when Chris says that it has this flavor density, that is usually what I care about the most, so I'm going to go through his reviews and find the one with the best flavor density, and that's the one that I'm going to buy. And I'm working on building a database specifically for that. You might not know this if you just listen to the podcast, but on my Patreon page, the Whiskey Noobs crew, I do reviews on there. Every bottle that I am sent for review gets a review on there because I feel like I don't have any algorithms I have to appease. I can really take my time and tear it apart, right? But it's not a full podcast that needs editing and all those things. It's just a quick video that I throw together and I post it up on there. And so when I do those reviews, it's a review of every bottle that I'm sent for review. Post them on there, and while I'm doing them, I am going through and doing a rating. And I say the rating in that video review, but I'm also writing it down on a sheet that I am tracking in order to have all of my ratings on one Google sheet. Then, if you're interested, hey, what does he think of this? What does he think of that? You can hop on that sheet, and then you can see exactly what I think about the different things that are on there. Hopefully, the goal is to like get that sheet to be huge to where then it's a really nice, quick guide that you can look up what was good about that whiskey, what was not good about that whiskey. Anyhow, that's all just from my point of view. But we're going to break down what goes into that sheet, because even if it's not me, even if it's an online blog that you really enjoy, even if it's somebody on TikTok or Instagram totally different from me that you enjoy, you want to know which buzzwords they're using, which buzzwords isn't the right word, which keywords they're using to indicate these things that are important to you, and which things, maybe they despise the finish, and maybe you're somebody who the finish doesn't matter to you at all. Then that's a really important thing to know. It just means that you have a different opinion from them, which is totally fine, but at least you know that that's why they're giving the review that they're giving. And I think, hopefully, that should really help you to save some money in future purchases. That's kind of my whole goal, is to help empower people to go to the liquor store or go to the online liquor store. And by the way, we have an online liquor store, if you didn't know that already. What is it? Noobswhiskey.com. Took me a second to remember that. Noobswhiskey.com. So anyhow, if you're going to the liquor store, I want to empower you to make the right decisions so that you buy bottles that most of the time, at least most of the time, you're happy with the purchase that you made. So that's what we're digging into today. And in order to answer those questions, in order to understand whiskey, you need to understand what you're looking at. So let's start with my rating system. Now, this is my rating system thus far. And as I mentioned, we're going to kind of go through things I like about it and things that I think I might change about it. So my rating system is nose, flavor density, complexity, harshness, and finish. That's 5 elements. I take each of those out of 10 points, so just a rating 1 to 10 of all of those, and I do 0.5s. I do, blank, point blank, basically. I think 0.5 is as precise as I get, though. I don't go down to like 0.1 or anything like that. I take each of those out of 10, and then I double that, and I get a rating out of 100. And then I take that rating out of 100, and I can do plus or minus 10 more points, plus or minus 10 for subjectivity. So anytime I rate a whiskey, especially for the Whiskey Noobs crew, I give 2 ratings. I give my objective rating, which is those 5 elements I just mentioned. We're about to break them down. And then I modify it by plus or minus 10, which it can be anywhere in there. Plus 4, plus 3, minus 5, whatever. Plus or minus 10. And that's the subjective score. That is like what I think. The other score is objective. I don't remember if I said that properly. The first score is objective. The second score is subjective. It's for me. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about what goes into that objective score, which is really doing the heavy lifting. And then I also want to talk about subjectivity a little bit, which we'll get into. So the objective score. First things first, you got nose. And then you'll notice I break palate into 3 things: flavor density, complexity, harshness, and then finish. So the palate gets the heaviest weighting, which already is kind of a little bit of bias. It's me saying I think the palate is the most important, which I realize. However, I think like objective. I think it's hard to argue that the palate is not the most important. But that's why I break it into these 5 things, so that you can look at it and you can say, well, I actually care more about this, right? But I think the palate, there's so much going on. There is how much flavor you're getting. There is how complex that flavor is, how well the complexity of those flavors is working together. And then there's also like the harshness of it, which is kind of a separate thing. It kind of stands aside from it. And that's why I break it into 3 parts. But let's start with nose. So looking at the nose of whiskey, what makes a good nose? Well, first of all, how much you smell of flavor versus alcohol is makes a great nose. And that's also something that we're going to look at on the palate. But for the nose specifically, you want to be able to get your nose into that glass and smell it, or get it close to that glass and have I don't know if you can hear my dog barking, but something just set him off. Hold on. I'll cut this part out. Okay, I think he's done barking. Classic UPS guy. Anyhow, so you've got the nose that you want to smell a lot of flavor without having to hunt through alcohol smell. This is one that, in my opinion, is the most distinct as you move up in price. Moving up in price, you can very distinctly see the fog of alcohol smell starts to go away and the flavors jump out. And so That's the biggest thing for me with the nose. But there's also other things. There is, does it just smell bad, which is a little bit subjective. And so with smelling bad, with harshness, which we're going to get to on the palate with the finish, there are subjective elements to them. Excuse me. But in each instance, I'm not trying to look for something that smells bad subjectively, like I just don't like the smell of it. I'm trying to look for something that's clearly not supposed to be in there, right? So as an example, if I'm just going through a $40 run-of-the-mill bourbon and it's just meant to be a staple bourbon, it's meant to be one of your Knob Creeks, Knob Creek's a great example, actually. Let's use Knob Creek. Here's why. Knob Creek has a distinct nutty flavor to it. Okay, so that is a note in there that is a little different from a standard bourbon. But most of us recognize that it's part of the bourbon's character, right? And this is a gray area, don't get me wrong. But there are other flavors that I think are widely recognized. I think 90% of the people looking at my reviews are going to recognize this. These flavors are ones that are not meant to be in there. They're accidentally in there. So something like acetone, something like paint thinner, something like really strong rust, because that happens sometimes. Something like strong chemicals, that happens sometimes. And so those sorts of things, they do lean into gray area where they're kind of subjective, but I'm trying to keep it as objective as possible by just looking at things that are impurities. They're things that are probably not supposed to be in there. So anyhow, I recognize that that's a gray area, but if you're doing this on your own, then at least you can have that understanding of it. So looking at the nose, mostly, I would say the biggest thing is how much flavor am I getting? How easy is it to smell? How complex is it versus the amount of alcohol that I'm getting? And then on a second hand, is there anything noticeably impure, anything that's noticeably not supposed to be there? And so that's what I'm looking for in the nose. Flavor density. Flavor density is my favorite. This is the most important to me. This is just me personally. Flavor density is how much flavor am I getting versus the amount of alcohol burn that I'm getting. So in other words, it's similar to the nose, right? Am I having to look through the alcohol in order to get flavor? Or am I tasting it and then there's a little bit of a burn at the end? And this scales, which is why I use it, because it scales with proof, right? If I'm drinking something that's 120 proof, it's going to burn more than something that's 80 proof. However, if they did a good job with blending it, if they did a good job with picking a single barrel, if it's a single barrel, it should have so much more flavor at that 120 proof that I prefer it to the 80 proof, let's say, just as a vague example. And that's what flavor density is looking at. That's why I call it flavor density, because density is mass divided by volume. This is kind of like flavor units divided by burn units, kind of, which is, once again, it's kind of subjective in the sense that it's not an actual mathematical formula here. It's a gut feeling. But that's what I'm looking for with flavor density. For me, that's one of the most important. And I have scored some relatively inexpensive whiskeys pretty high for this reason. And I have scored some relatively expensive whiskeys somewhat low for this reason, because I think that it's the most important, at least for me. And I also think for your average person, it's the most important. I think sometimes these distillers get lost in complexity and they forget that most people just want to taste the goodness without tasting the badness. And so that's why that's the most important one for me. Now, it doesn't get any extra weight over complexity or harshness, but for me personally, that's my favorite category. That's the one that I think is the most important. Then you've got complexity. Complexity is where I think you really see an increase with price increase. Sometimes I've had a couple of blind tastings where I was like, this is scoring really high, but complexity is really low. And that was my telltale, this is a less expensive whiskey. That is a really common one to have score lower in a less expensive whiskey, which for your average person, a lot of the times, especially if you're going to be making cocktails with it or something like that, that's actually not a big deal. It's not a big deal to have a low complexity. And so I have a lot of whiskeys that I highly recommend because they score well in the other categories and they just don't score well in complexity. But I digress. What is complexity, right? It's a vague one. It's a weird one. It's hard to nail down. It's kind of shifty, right? The way I like to put complexity is like this. You have an orchestra, right? And that orchestra is a bunch of different instruments all playing a song. You could have one instrument. You could have a trumpet solo. That's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal trumpet solo, but it's just a trumpet, okay? That would be a whiskey that tastes really good, but it just kind of tastes like one thing. It just tastes like butterscotch, or it just tastes like raspberries. I think Eagle Rare and E.H. Taylor are a little bit this way. I get strong like berry fruit notes from them, and I don't get much else. But I think they're really, really good at doing that note. That would be like a trumpet solo. That's not very complex. That might score really well in flavor density and really well in harshness, which I would say both Eagle Rare and E.H. Taylor that I mentioned would, but it's not going to score the greatest in complexity. Complexity is like you have a whole orchestra. You have a bunch of different instruments all playing. Okay, so it's not a trumpet solo. You've got your woodwinds, you've got your brass instruments, you got your string instruments. They're all playing. You got percussion, whatever, right? So they're all playing. Now, there is still a way to have all those instruments in this metaphor and score poorly in complexity. And this is where the metaphor is really helpful, okay? Because I can tell you one flavor, not very complex. But you could have a bunch of flavors. You could have a bunch of different flavor notes. And I would say you'd still score poorly in complexity. The way you would do that, and there's no way to describe this without metaphor, but the way you would do that is you have all these different flavor notes, and they kind of interfere with each other and get in each other's way in a clunky way. And so the metaphor that helps make this a lot more clear is it's like you have the whole orchestra, you have all those different sections, but they're all off by like a beat or a half a beat. They're not in line, and you can tell that. And that weirdly does happen with flavor notes as well. That you can have, a great example, you can have a little bit of a fruit with a little bit of an oak with a little bit of a drier note like a leather or a tobacco. And sometimes those notes will hit you in a way that it's like, oh, that's nice and sweet. Oh, that oak tones it down a little bit though. Oh, and then it kind of settles into this nice tobacco flavor. Or you can have those hit you where it's like, this tastes like charred fruit with super ashy oak char on it and burnt tobacco. Like they just don't mix properly. It's basically the same notes. They're just not mixing in the right way. They're interfering with one another instead of working together. Another way the last way that I'll put complexity, because it's a weird one and I just want to help you understand what I mean when I say it, is another metaphor that I've used is if you have a meal or a snack that has multiple ingredients, there are some meals where you don't want to blend those ingredients together. You want to taste them individually. Think of a cheeseburger. You've got a nice thick burger patty. You've got pickles on top. You've got cheese on top of that. You've got your condiments like your mustard and your ketchup. You take a bite out of it, and at first you get the char from the burger, and then you notice that zing of the pickle. Then the condiments come through. That's one way to experience a cheeseburger, right? Another way would be to put that cheeseburger in a blender and blend it until it's all one consistent color all the way through of sludge. And regardless of the fact that the sludge is gross, pretend like the sludge, the texture's not gross, and you eat it, it's going to taste different than the cheeseburger tasted. And that is another example of how you can have these flavors, but they just kind of blend together, versus having them separately the way you would want them with a cheeseburger, the way you want them with a chocolate chip cookie, where you get some cookie and you get some chocolate chip. You don't just get, if you melted the chocolate chips and put them in the cookie and blended them all the way through, you just have like a kind of a chocolatey cookie. That's different. So that is one last aspect that can really affect complexity. You can have just one flavor, obviously not complex. You can have your flavors not working together and getting each other's way. That's low complexity. Or you could have your flavors, there's multiple, but they just kind of blend together. They just kind of blend right in. And that's also not very complex. So those are kind of the different angles you can have with complexity. So the best complexity would be the orchestra with all of the instruments and they're all in sync. The cheeseburger with all the ingredients and they all show up separately. That would be good complexity. Then we've got harshness. Harshness is pretty simple because we already covered most of it on the nose. It's very similar to what I was talking about on the nose. Are there any flavors that probably aren't supposed to be there? And I've had some reviews where I've actually scored it pretty well and said, I don't like this because it has a note in it that I don't like. To me, those notes are combining in a way that reminds me of something that I smelled years ago and really didn't enjoy. Something like that. That does not count against harshness. Those type of notes do not count against harshness. Harshness is something you're looking for that is an impurity in the whiskey. There are different compounds, and this happens at distilleries a lot. They'll go through and they'll taste their distillate, and they're looking for different compounds there's a bunch of different ones. I forget all the different names of them, but just trust me on this. There's a bunch of different compounds that you would look for in that tasting panel that are not supposed to be there. They happened because something went wrong in the fermentation, or something went wrong. The still temperature went too high and then swung down too low. Something along those lines happened, and it put a compound into the whiskey that's not supposed to be there. And they look for those when they're doing these flavor panels. They're going through and they're tasting the distillate. That is the essence. That's the spirit. Spirit is not meant to be a pun, but it is. That's the spirit of what I'm looking for in harshness. I'm looking, is there something that's not supposed to be here? Too much of it got into this whiskey. So a good example would be sometimes whiskeys get way too salty. And that's not really like I subjectively don't like salt. That's like something went wrong, okay? So especially some of these ones that are aged at the ocean, aged on, well, different types of water, or aged near the ocean, I should say, on like a coastal region. Sometimes they'll just get really salty. So you could have like an Ardbeg that has like a sea spray note to it. It's really nice. It's like a little touch of salt. Then you could have something that just comes through as like you're drinking salt water. Okay, I've had a couple that come through that way. That's one example. Another would be like the acetone note. That comes from different compounds that probably are not supposed to be in there. I don't think anybody intentionally wants their whiskey to taste like it just has acetone added into it, or like it has a lot of grain alcohol added into it. Those are the type of things that I'm looking for with harshness. Importantly, this is not how much alcohol burn that the whiskey has. This is harsh impurities that the whiskey has. Alcohol burn is covered in flavor density. I scale the alcohol burn based on the amount of flavor intentionally, and so that's back in flavor density. Harshness is something a little bit different. And then, of course, we've got the finish. There's a few different aspects to a finish, okay? How long does the finish last? Do you continue to taste it for a while, or does it just stop abruptly? A better finish is going to last a while. You're going to continue to taste it. You can have some time in between your sips without it causing any problems for you. Also, what happens to the flavor during the finish? Similar to the nose, where it's like, let's try to be objective here, but do you have this nice, delightful whiskey, and then after you swallow it, it just tastes like you licked charred oak, and it tastes super ashy? Because that'll happen sometimes. Clearly, some of those aspects are not intentionally in the whiskey. Those are clearly just something that's kind of happening, right? And once again, I'm openly admitting throughout this entire episode, there's no way to be perfectly objective. If there was a science to this, then somebody would have made a bunch of money off of it by now, and they would be scientifically producing the perfect whiskey. There's not. It's definitely a little bit subjective. It's a little bit of an art form, but that is the type of thing that I'm looking for in finish, and that is evident, that's the word I'm looking for, evident throughout all of the 5 different aspects that I just mentioned. So, of course, they're a little bit of a gray area, and that's why I give 5 to 10 minute reviews on my Patreon page so that I can accurately explain why I'm giving it the rating that I'm giving it. But then, once you understand, at least me as a reviewer, or a different reviewer that you like, once you understand them and the things that they're saying, then you don't need that long of an explanation. You can just say, Chris said the flavor density is this. I know that this usually means this based on the things that he says, and move on with your life. That's kind of the goal of my rating system. Now, on a personal level, for you, if you develop your rating system, it's even easier, right? Because you can just understand, this is what I mean. If it's salty, I usually score harshness low. If it tastes like this, I score this low. You can understand your own gray area, which will help you determine what you want to buy next. So if you develop your own rating system, that is how mine works. Feel free to change it. Feel free to do whatever you want. Honestly, change it to fit what you find the most important. But at least now my goal is that you know the types of things that I'm looking at when I'm reviewing a whiskey. Now, there's one thing that I really want to touch on, and that is, well, 2 things actually. The first is the subjective modifier, okay? So after I do all those 5 things, they're out of 10 points. That gives me a score out of 50. I double that score out of 50 to get a score out of 100. And then I can add or subtract 10 points. So theoretically, the perfect whiskey that also tastes exactly how I want it could score 110. However, that has never happened. I'm not giving 10s. I have never given a 10 in any category. To me, that's like absolutely perfect, could not even be improved. That being said, the subjective modifier is there for how much do I like the flavors. You'll notice in everything that I said, there's a little bit of gray area, but for the most part, I'm largely not looking at the type of flavor. I'm looking at flavor density, how much flavor comes through. I'm not looking at, is that flavor caramel Or is that flavor kind of grass clippings? Is that flavor? I had one the other day that blew my mind. It tasted like celery. Couldn't believe that. But is that flavor celery, right? So that's a great example, actually, because celery might get a great score across all 5 categories. And then when I go to add the subjective modifier, that's going to get a -10 because I hate the flavor of celery, and I had a whiskey that reminded me of it. But that's subjective. That's me. There are people out there who love celery, or even who maybe don't care about celery at all, but they try that whiskey and they go, there's something unique here that I really enjoy, so I'm going to rate this really high. That's what the subjective modifier is for. It's important to keep in mind, like, your preferences. Like, what do you like? You want to have that in mind as well. So subjective modifier is an important one. And there's something else that I've missed that some of you might be sitting here thinking, he's done all this talking. He's never mentioned this one thing that's important to me. And that's mouthfeel. And that's because mouthfeel is largely unimportant to me. I don't notice it very much. I know that there are some with different viscosities. So if you're new to whiskey, what we mean by mouthfeel is, does it have a feel to it where it's very thin, like rubbing alcohol, and it runs across your tongue and it kind of spreads out and kind of evaporates a little bit? Does it have a feel to it where it's thick, it's syrupy, it kind of moves across your tongue, it makes your mouth feel stuck together a little bit, it feels real thick in your mouth? This could be clipped to sound horrible, so I apologize, but that's what we mean by mouthfeel. And there's 2 things. So the first is that I don't really notice it. The second is that it is kind of somewhat covered in flavor density, because flavor density is looking at alcohol burn versus flavor. Well, if you have a really viscous, thick whiskey, that is like characteristically, I don't think I've ever had one where it's thick and it's viscous, but it scores poorly on flavor density. That is characteristically a whiskey that's probably not going to burn very much, but it's probably going to have a nice amount of flavor, right? So it's partially included in flavor density. Now, all that being said, I do still think I need to include mouthfeel. So I think I'm going to potentially modify this scale moving forward, and those that are part of the Whiskey Noobs crew will see that happen in real time. I'm probably going to modify this scale to include something with mouthfeel. And I don't know how I'm going to do it quite yet. My guess is I'm going to take something else from the palate and cut it down to 5 points, and then cut mouthfeel to 5 points. So as an example, as I'm thinking about this, like, harshness for me is a little bit less important unless it's like really, really harsh, in which case it would score really, really poorly. But I think the difference, when I'm scoring out of 10 for harshness, the difference between like a 6 and a 9 is a little slim. It's a little bit like, there's a little bit of a difference here. But like, if it's got a really, really good flavor density, then harshness doesn't matter that much. And so I might cut harshness in half, or I might do something different. We'll see. I will definitely communicate that to the Whiskey Noobs crew when and if I make that change. But mouthfeel is also very important. And it's one of those that I have been shocked, just living in my little bubble of rating my own whiskeys, I've been shocked by how much it does matter to people. I've had people be like, mouthfeel for me is like the most important. I'm pretty sure, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think Brandon from Whiskey Weather said that in the episode that we did on our Old Elk pick. I could be wrong about that, but I'm thinking he mentioned like mouthfeel is extremely important to him. I could be wrong, but I know he's mentioned mouthfeel multiple times when I've talked to him. So there are some people that's just like very important. And so I want to make sure that I am respecting that in my reviews and getting across the idea that, how does the mouthfeel actually come through? So you'll see. We'll see. That might actually be something that changes here in the next couple of weeks as I continue to walk through all my reviews that I'm given. It's roughly 1 to 2 reviews per week usually on Patreon, and I'll continue walking through those and determining how I want to do that. So we'll see. Now, I want to wrap up with some possible factors. Before I wrap up, I should say, I just want to very quickly hit some things that might also influence your decision. Some other things that I don't include because, to me, these are highly, highly subjective. I don't include them in my ratings, but they might be important to you, especially depending on what you're buying the bottle of whiskey for. So the first is presentation. Pretty obvious, right? Like, is it in a nice bottle? Does it have a nice label? Are you buying it to set on a shelf somewhere people are going to see, or are you buying it and it's going to stay in a cabinet where nobody's going to see it? Maybe presentation matters for you. You might want to think about that. Rarity. How rare is this? Is that important to you? Is it important how rare a whiskey is and that it's kind of hard to get? Maybe you want to buy it because of that. On the flip side of that coin, availability. If you're listening to me review something and you want to go out and buy it, How available is it? That could be really important to you. So maybe that helps influence whether or not you want to buy something. Do you want to have to hunt it out, or do you just want to walk into your local liquor store and it's right there? The story behind the whiskey. What distillery does this come from? Is it a big box distillery? Is it a mom and pop? Is it somebody who retired and pursued their dream? That might influence it. This influences me. I'll be totally honest with you. Not in like the objective ratings that I try to do. I try to leave this completely out. But in my personal opinions, like the brands that I choose to fangirl over, they are affected by the story of the brand. There are some brands that just blow me away by the people behind the brands and the reasons they got into them. And I really enjoy that. And so I'm willing to pay a couple bucks more for that awesome story. Speaking of paying a couple bucks more, is it craft or not? You're going to pay. I've called it a couple things. I've called it giving them bonus points for being craft, or I would call it the craft tax, which is like a craft whiskey, especially a grain to glass craft whiskey where they didn't do any vodkas or gins. They just wanted to make good whiskey. So they made whiskey and they sat on it for a couple of years. You're going to have a little bit of an upcharge there, okay? This also goes for blending, by the way, because blending, the person who created blending with sourced whiskey. The person who bought the sourced whiskey is going to have to pay a little bit of a premium for it because the person who distilled the whiskey needs to make money on it, and then that person needs to sell it at a premium because they need to make money, and that kind of stacks up. So, craft whiskey tax. Some of these craft brands, you're going to have to pay a little bit more because they are craft and because they just by their nature, they cost a little bit more. Maybe that's totally unimportant to you. Just go to the big box brands. You're probably going to get some phenomenal deals. Maybe that's really important to you. You don't want the industry to be overcome by the big box brands. I'm not saying either way is right or not right. I'm just saying it's something you're going to want to think about. Another thing would be, are you serving this to company? Or are you going to be sharing it with friends? Is it going to be at a bottle share? Do you often have people over who want to drink your whiskey? If so, that's going to influence things. You might not want to spend $80 on the really hyper complex, huge flavor density, really nice bottle. You might just want to spend $40 on a bottle that isn't very complex, has a little bit of harshness to it, but man, is it flavor dense. You just get a strong flavor all the way through. That might be more important to you. So you want to understand the use of it, and that's going to affect what's important to you as well. And then that might also impact, do you want it to be very approachable? Is the nose important? Is the finish important? It affects all those things. And then lastly, the last added factor that I would give would be flexibility, robustness. In other words, do you know you're always going to drink this neat, or do you want one that you can add ice to on a hot day? Do you want one that you can make a cocktail out of and it's still going to stand up nicely in a cocktail? That is definitely going to impact things. So, just as an example, it should already be posted by the time you're listening to this. I did a video on Instagram of my favorite whiskey for the summertime. And this is just my favorite whiskey right now. You guys who've been listening a long time, you know I change my opinion all the time. But right now, I'm really loving Barrel Seagrass for hot weather. One thing that actually gives it a huge advantage over others is that it's at barrel strength. And so when it's hot outside, I can add some ice to it. It's going to get a little bit watered down, but it's still going to have a strong, good flavor. That's one of the reasons that I like it so much. So I'm not, in the summertime, if I'm going to have to add ice, I'm not going for something 80 proof because then I'm barely going to be able to taste it when I add ice. That's just me personally, but you're going to want to understand is flexibility something that's important to you. So, to put all of that in a nutshell, I think I've monologued long enough. There's a lot that you can consider when you're trying to figure out what you want to do for a whiskey, what you want to value, what's going to be important to you. At the end of the day, all that matters is that you enjoy it, and I hope that I don't muddy that at all. I want you to understand if you go to a bar, you don't have to have this super refined palate to know if a whiskey is good or not. You can just taste it and be like, I like that. That's totally fine. But if you want to dive deeper, if you want to help predict what you're going to like and whether you're going to like it based on people's reviews, preferably my reviews, but whatever you want to do, then those are things you're going to want to look at. So there's a lot to consider, but don't let it cloud your vision. Don't let it muddy the waters too much, but just maybe consider it if you're trying to figure out what you want to buy next. So hopefully this was a helpful guide to help you figure out what to buy next. And if you enjoyed this show, as always, please check out the Whiskey Noobs crew down in the description below. That is the best way to support this show. That is the best way to support the YouTube channel as well, where I'm doing the more edited content on YouTube. That's the best way to get the barrel picks that I've talked about. You get first in line for different barrel picks. You get all of those reviews that I mentioned in this episode. You get lots of really cool stuff, so please consider going and checking that out. And if you don't, I totally understand, but please like, subscribe, leave a rating, leave a review, leave a comment, whatever you can do on the platform platform that you're on helps me out a ton. Thank you guys all so much for watching Whiskey Noobs. I will leave you with learn to drink, drink to learn.